Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Cal and Coca Report. I'm delighted to have as our guest Christopher Snowdon, who's a freelance journalist with an interest in the intrusion of public health into the daily lives of ordinary people. He is also head of lifestyle economics at the Institute for Economic Affairs in London. He's the author of many books, including Velvet Glove, Iron Fist, A History of Anti-Smoking, published in 2009, that tells the backstory to the tobacco wars. He also wrote The Art of Suppression, Pleasure, Panic, and Prohibition since 1800, which was published in 2011, Killjoys, A Critique of Paternalism, published in 2017, and more recently, Polemics, an anthology of articles he's written on economics, politics, science, and culture. Chris, welcome to the show.
Very nice to be here.
It's great to have you. Chris, I had reached out to you initially to talk about something that caught my attention. I heard it mentioned that Brexit may have contributed to the success in the vaccination rollout in the UK. And I wanted to get your opinion on that. But then when I reached out to you, I saw that recently you had set off a huge debate among free market-minded people and libertarians regarding lockdowns. So I'd love to talk about that and get your perspective on that as well. Let's start with the Brexit question. So the UK is now well into its vaccination campaign. Maybe half the population has been vaccinated, maybe more. It's very rapid, and some people have argued that it's thanks to Brexit that this has happened, because now it's no longer has to follow the UK no longer has to follow the edicts of Brussels. At the same time, I hear a counter campaign of Tony Blair yesterday in The Guardian was mentioned as saying, no, it has nothing to do with Brexit and whatnot. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the Brexiteers say it's about Brexit and the Remainers say it isn't. The truth is kind of in between, actually. I mean, the Europeans, well, the EU countries, they had an arrangement by which they were going to get together and jointly collaborate with their vaccination program and bid for the various vaccines they were buying, and we opted out of it. And that was a very good move, as it turns out, because the EU was very slow. It kind of focused on getting a cheap deal rather than getting the vaccines quickly and in large numbers. And so the EU's vaccination program has unquestionably been much worse than the UK's. We haven't quite done half the population. We've done over 20 million now, which is more than a third of the adult population, and we're going at a rate of knots of about 500,000 people a day on a good day. Whereas places like France, I think they've only done something like 4% of the population. I mean, really, really poor numbers. So the Brexit element is this. Any country could have opted out of this EU arrangement. They weren't compelled to be in it, but none of them did. And it's very unlikely, I think, if we'd had still been in the EU, that we would have done either. Hungary more recently has opted out of it and gone its own way, but all the rest of them decided to stick with the deal. So I think in practice, although as a matter of kind of legality, it wasn't Brexit per se, Britain could have opted out of this arrangement. The reality is almost certainly had we been in the EU, we would have felt the need, because of solidarity and all this kind of stuff, right, to stick with the EU.
Right. Well, that's fair. That's fair. But I mean, along with that, I mean, it may not be Brexit per se directly, but at least there's a wind of decentralization, right? That and more autonomy and being more nimble, I imagine, among the people who run the show currently in government in the UK.
Yeah, and the vaccination program has been an example of that. I mean, the EU has shown itself to be very sclerotic and slow and incompetent, really. So that alone kind of gives you hope that, being outside the EU is going to be beneficial. We haven't done that many things as a country yet in terms of using our newfound independence. We've got rid of the tax on tampons. I can't think of anything else that immediately springs to mind. But of course, we've been very busy with other things, and we've only been out of the EU for fully, with our own trade deal for a month or two.
Right.
So in time we shall see. You know, I mean, people have totally different expectations about what they want out of Brexit. It was a very strange coalition of people, some of whom were very conservative and anti-immigration, to people who were very left-wing and thought that they, you know, with Brexit, the government could interfere more in industrial policy and nationalisation and
Mhm.
stuff, because the EU actually does have some quite good free market liberal policies designed to stop the far left doing the things they want. And then there's free market libertarians like me who would like to get rid of a lot of unnecessary regulation. So it could go one of any number of ways, and it probably will go in all sorts of different ways at the same time. But you know, we've got to be hopeful that we can get on the deregulatory agenda. And at the very least, I think what will happen is we won't be bound by future regulations that the EU brings in. You know, the EU is constantly centralizing and constantly over-regulating. And even if we don't repeal a lot of EU directives that are already in place, I don't think we're going to join in, you know, out of choice with some of the stuff that's coming down the line.
Right. But you're right that it's an open question because, and now we can maybe segue into the question of lockdowns, because in March of last year, it looked for a moment as if Boris Johnson and the government wanted to try out the laissez-faire approach to the pandemic. That was very brief, of course, and then they've turned around um, and in effect have had the UK has had one of the more severe or most severe lockdown policies certainly lately, in the towards the end of the year. And so being part of Brexit also doesn't mean that necessarily you're going to be less liberal, more liberal or more free market than what it would have been under the EU. And certainly it could be worse. Now, you are a man with impeccable libertarian credentials, yet you find yourself right now, or you have perhaps during the year, I'm not sure, at odds with many libertarians on the question of lockdowns. Just tell us a little bit what your position is, if I can take a moment to explain where you differ from the mainstream anti-lockdown movement.
Well, we've had 3 lockdowns in Britain. The first one towards the end of March, which lasted a very long time, 3.5 months, really. And I thought that went on far too long, but I did support it initially. And then we had a 4-week lockdown in November, which I didn't think was necessary. And then we had a lockdown starting, I think, the 6th of January, which is still ongoing and will probably continue to exist in some form until May or June. But not like a stay-at-home lockdown. That's going to end by the end of March, I think. But there'll still be quite a lot of restrictions on bars and restaurants, for example, opening up indoors. So my position is really based on welfare economics. You know, I tend to think that libertarianism is just applied economics, really. The lessons of economics, and especially microeconomics, are basically libertarian. You know, you leave people alone and you leave businesses alone unless there is a negative externality issue or a market failure. And even then, you need pretty good evidence that the government is actually going to improve things rather than make them worse, because there's a lot of government failure too. With any pandemic, you have a collective action problem, because one person's actions, affect other people, and people with different incentives can lead to bad outcomes. So with this particular virus, it's very well known that it heavily affects old people and it doesn't really affect young people most of the time. So the incentive for an individual to stay away from other people and socially distance and wash their hands and all the rest of it is not that great if they're 20 years old. But of course, if they're reckless, for want of a better word, it doesn't take long for the virus to spread and it moves up the age groups, and ultimately people die as a result. So there's a collective action problem there, which is made even worse by one of the most insidious features of the SARS-CoV-2, which is it has a very long incubation period. And so even if people think they are acting cautiously and responsibly, even if they think there isn't much COVID in their local area, they don't really know. You only find out after the fact. and somebody who might seem to be perfectly healthy, in fact, carries the virus and is spreading it. And so you see, as a result of that, very, very rapid increases in the number of cases and deaths in some places. Ireland is a very good example of this. The Irish government's had a lot of lockdowns actually over the course of the last 12 months and has generally kept the virus under control, probably at excessive cost in my view. And then over Christmas, people were allowed to mix. There were still a lot of restrictions, but they were allowed to mix with one other household at home. And that alone led to an enormous spike in cases. It was the worst affected area in the world, I think, briefly in January. And then a lockdown came in and rates fell very quickly. But it was a good example and a cautionary tale of how quickly this thing can spread. And no one means to spread it. And no one wants to get it. And yet it does spread very rapidly, and particularly at wintertime when people are spending a lot of time in indoor, unventilated places. So because there's a collective action problem, my view is that there is room for government action. And the only thing that's ever really worked, at least in Britain, has been lockdowns, unfortunately. As soon as we've eased lockdowns, rates have gone up, sometimes quite slowly, sometimes very rapidly, but they've gone up. And the remorseless logic of exponential growth means that you will get to a point where vast numbers of people have the virus and the healthcare system is overloaded. And the healthcare system being overloaded, again, creates negative externalities, even if you haven't got the virus, because your operation gets cancelled. In January, our hospitals were very seriously overloaded, not just with them having to cancel elective surgery and routine medical care, but also having to take people to other parts of the country because there just weren't any beds. And that, I'm sure, would have got a lot worse had we not had a lockdown. We saw rates doubling every 2 weeks in December. There was no reason at all to think that that was going to stop or even necessarily slow down. And even if we'd have stayed at the rates we were at in late December, it still would have massively overloaded the healthcare system. So for me, that was a red line. And that was kind of the government's red line when they moved from their sort of herd immunity strategy to their lockdown strategy. They weren't going for zero COVID. They weren't trying to get rid of the virus or prevent anybody from ever dying of it. We were realistic about the fact that, this is a natural phenomenon. People are going to die. People die all the time of all sorts of things, and you don't want to overreact. And lockdowns are a very damaging, both socially and economically, damaging option. So you don't want to do them except as a last resort. But we found ourselves twice in the last year in a position where, in the government's view and in the view of most people and in my view, lockdown was the only option. And I think you can justify that on the basis of welfare economics. If you value human life, and if you are prepared to kind of put a price on human life, which is a kind of rather arbitrary and controversial thing to do, but it makes sense if you're an economist. You do value human life, and so you put a value on human life. I think if you do that, you can certainly justify this lockdown. I'm not convinced actually that you can justify the whole year-long palaver that we've had. I think maybe in purely economic terms, it might have been better just to allow the thing to spread in March. But even then, I'm not sure that would definitely stack up. And given it would lead to hundreds of thousands of lives, I think you're probably better off erring on the side of caution.
So there's been a number of objections made to your arguments, notably by Toby Young. You debated him back and forth on the pages of Quillette, and then I think you had a debate on Talk Radio, and we'll put a link to that on the show notes. Before I get to, I mentioned some of his objections. There's one objection. I wonder if it would mitigate your stance a little bit. So the NHS is notoriously always, even pre-COVID, always kind of on the brink of shutting down, right? We've had stories of people being treated in the hallways, for years now. And so would your position change a little bit if you lived in a country where the healthcare system actually had a lot more capacity, or was a lot more nimble and a lot more capacity to adjust and accommodate for the influx of cases and hospitalizations?
Yeah, up to a point it would do, because as I say, that's my red line. The overwhelming of the health service, I think, is the red line. So if you have more capacity, I guess you have a little bit more wriggle room. But if you've got cases doubling every week or two, then I don't think there's any health system in the world that has enough critical care beds. I mean, this is another of the really problematic things about this particular virus is it's incredibly draining of healthcare resources, because people who go to hospital very often need to be in intensive care. And I mean, in Britain, for example, you know, in a bad flu season, and you're quite right about the NHS constantly collapsing under the weight of these things. You know, we have a winter crisis every year, and most countries don't. We do, because when lots of people get flu, the hospitals get very close to capacity. But even in a bad flu year, we'd have about 3,000 people at any one time in a critical care bed. This winter, we've had over 5,000 people. And we've created that capacity over the course of the summer because we knew the second wave was coming. You know, how many critical care beds can you, you know, as a matter of, you know, practical considerations, create? I mean, not that many. I mean, you could create field hospitals and all sorts, but if you've got exponential growth, it's always going to get overwhelmed. You're just going to end up with more people dying. So I don't know if it really gets you anywhere.
I'm not sure. I mean, I mean, it's what you're saying is plausible. At the same time, you know, the U.S. has been hit very hard, and even New York, at its peak, at its worst, back in March. If you, I mean, clearly there was, you know, some hospitals were overwhelmed, but if you take aside kind of the hysteria, I mean, a little bit, it was, you know, that was spread on social media about, you know, we're completely overrun. If you look carefully, even in New York City, there were hospitals that were actually not that bad, and then they ended up, you know, putting out a field hospital, and it ended up not getting used. Now, granted, a lockdown was instituted, you know, so I'm aware of that, but I mean, there is a, I mean, one could say that maybe you know, the way the government should intervene is not necessarily to introduce lockdowns. We'll talk in a moment about the arguments of people saying that lockdowns don't work, but you know, one could say, listen, we should, the government, the intervention should be primarily to increase the capacity, and to the extent that we allow them to lock down each time there's a crisis, we're kind of enabling their you know, their perpetual incompetence. And
well, I mean, this is a kind of once in a century event, really, and I don't think you can set your healthcare system up for a once in a century event. I mean, it's not even just an issue of creating field hospitals. You have to have the staff to look after the people, right. And you can't suddenly double or treble the number of doctors and nurses who are available.
You can actually.
How?
So you run a fee-for-service system like the United States runs, which you know, basically you have a massive amount. I mean, in any one hospital, there is 80% of it is being used for elective services. So, you know, so suddenly, and this is what we said early on, that the American capacity in terms of healthcare is just absolutely gargantuan, because when you stop elective healthcare, suddenly you have massive amounts of ICU beds, all that staff that was taking care of, running around trying to take care of these elective patients, you know, ICUs that get filled up by post-op elective surgeries, etc. All of those get converted. So, I mean, in New York City, probably the biggest, the place with the biggest brunt in terms of healthcare resources and number of folks that were sick and needed critical care. Sloan Kettering, the cancer center, kept operating just fine. So there was a whole hospital that was operating. You know, anyway, the capacity is massive, even without bringing in field hospitals and having a country the size of the United States, where you can literally ship people from a place that doesn't have a bad outbreak at the time to a place here. I mean, so there is, obviously you can run with massive capacity, but one of the things, and by the way, I enjoyed thoroughly your debate with Toby Young back and forth. It was really, really, really fun. I wonder though, you know, there's so many assumptions that underlie, you know, Mr. Young's argument as well as yours. Is it, especially coming from a libertarian standpoint, where, you know, you have to be very careful about assumptions that are made, right? For instance, even right now, what we're talking about is a basic assumption that what is, you know, the critical care resources will be overwhelmed because of something like this that happens. But that's really a moving target. Like the critical care resources that were required, okay, in March in New York City, based on what the medical community knew, was very different than the critical care resources that were required 3 months later. Why is that? Because in March we were also terrified of the virus. Again, understandably so. That the moment somebody came in coughing and, you know, with possible COVID, the terrifying thing for the healthcare community who was taking care of that patient was that, oh my God, we're all going to get it, and we don't know what the mortality rate is. It could be 10%, could be 5%, could be 1%, could be 0.5%. We just don't know. So we act like it's 10%. And what do? We take people that are on their phones whose oxygen levels are a little low, and we say, get off your phone, we're going to intubate you, right? And that's a critical care bed automatically, all right? And that turned out to be a massive mistake. There's no question that there was a significant amount of mortality that was iatrogenic. I don't know that it could have been avoided. We had to learn somehow. Unfortunately, that's how medicine works. But, you know, again, my point in bringing this up is not to get into the details of you know, what we did, what we could have done different from a medical specific standpoint, but just to point out that what isn't in debate is the critical care resources needed in March in New York City is much different than the critical care resources that were needed when the outbreak hit, say, South Dakota. So we have to be really careful, because you're making then very large, you're based on these assumptions of overwhelming healthcare system, et cetera, you're then making very large static kind of policies that probably aren't going to evolve with how much local knowledge is adapting as things go on. So then you're back to, you know, Albert Camus and, you know, the city of Oran, right? Maybe the best thing is to just let local communities deal with whatever is happening at that local place. And then the role of all of us in terms of, you know, the federal government, national government response is to send in additional help when we notice X, Y, and Z places are being overwhelmed. Kind of like when you're fighting a war, right? When you fight a war, you know, you're not sending 3,000, you know, tanks to every single place along the, you know, Prussian border. You know, you're getting information locally and then sending places where you need it. So, well, and it's a very long, I'm sorry for the long-winded exposition here, but what are your thoughts on the fact that, you know, making these larger assumptions based on, say, critical care resources, based on overwhelming the health system? These are not things to be decided on nationally.
Well, England's a lot smaller place than America, you know, and one of the consequences of that is that the virus spreads much quicker. So yeah, there were local differences in the second wave. London and the southeast were hit very badly. Partly that's due to the so-called UK variant, which does seem to transmit a lot faster than the common or garden variant, COVID. And we were sending people to other parts of the country. Yeah, absolutely. There was more room in North Yorkshire than there was in London, but that wasn't going to last very long either, by the looks of it. You know, the trajectory of the thing. London was already overwhelmed. There was every reason to think that the rest of the country would very quickly be overwhelmed. We'd already had the experience in March. We knew what we were, you know, we knew what we had coming. Like New York, we realized that we didn't need to put as many people on mechanical ventilation as we were doing in the first wave. Nevertheless, despite using that less, we ended up with more people on mechanical ventilation than in the first wave, because there was just more people who were sick and dying of it. So, yeah, I mean, the debate with Toby Young, you know, talk about assumptions. I mean, you can never prove or disprove a counterfactual. That's the thing. So, you know, when he says, oh, well, you know, rates would have fallen down, you know, would have fallen anyway, you can't categorically disprove that. And he can always say, well, what about Florida, where they seem to be doing okay? And what can you say to that other than, you know, Britain isn't Florida? You know, my argument isn't that the healthcare system might have been overwhelmed. My argument is that it actually was overwhelmed. And at the beginning of December, Toby probably would have said, "There's not going to be a second wave. This is going to be all right. It's all going away now," which is what he did say in summer. He explicitly said that there won't be a second wave. We've got herd immunity. So a lot of these people have been wrong many times and way too optimistic. And what happened in December was itself a massive problem, and it almost certainly would have got worse, because there's no reason to think it wouldn't. It was the middle of winter. Even at the height of the second wave, you only had 2% of the population with COVID at any given time. Round about 3/4 of the population haven't had it, and there's no reason to think they're not susceptible to it. So the scope for this thing spiraling seemed to be almost limitless, and it would have been a massive gamble for the government to say at the beginning of January, we think it's just going to kind of fade away on its own now, because nothing in science suggested it was going to do that.
Right. So, I mean, you're very good, I think, at calling out some of the, as you said, the very optimistic stances that the anti-lockdown people took over the course of the year. In fact, I think that's what set off the debate. You wrote a piece in Quillette called, I think, the COVID cranks or something like that. But it's interesting, because it seems to me that most of the claims on both sides of the issues, I think Anish was alluding to that. If you take every single claim, each one of them has kind of some plausibility to it. I mean, we know the government, the case demics, we know the statistics can be manipulated. We know that a lot of PCR cases don't mean diseases, right? I mean, we've had very prominent WHO people on the podcast, and they said, why are we, they themselves were saying, why are we, counting those PCR positive cases who are completely asymptomatic? Why are we calling them cases as opposed to just, abnormal tests and whatnot? That was in the summer before the winter wave hit, right? So I mean, I can understand why the lockdown skeptics would sort of make a little bit of mistakes by assuming that because the numbers are meaningless, that this is either a fabricated disease, or it's a disease that it's a non-epidemic. There was also reason to be cautious, but it's very difficult. Every single sort of argument on both sides, as far as I can tell, is plausible. It's not that it's...
Well, they were more plausible in the summer than they are now, and they've been thoroughly discredited now. In the summer, it was nothing less than human nature to just hope that this thing might have faded away somehow, and maybe millions of people did have T cells that mean they couldn't get it, and maybe for whatever reason it was just fading away and it wasn't come back, or maybe we could use contact tracing as a way of keeping this under control for now. People had all sorts of different reasons to be optimistic about this, and you looked at somewhere like Sweden, where the rates had gone down at more or less the same pace as they had in Britain, and you thought, maybe we are overreacting, maybe things are going to be okay. And the issue with cases is kind of weird how this whole PCR thing became such a massive issue, and still is with some people. We had really quite low cases in the summer and low hospitalizations and mortality. And again, it was optimism. People were thinking, well, it's only young people getting this. A lot of them are asymptomatic. It's not really a public health problem, which is kind of true up to a point. And so you got this kind of case demic, and it was possible, I guess, that a lot of these test results were false positives. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and the reality is that the case numbers very accurately predicted how many hospitalizations you were going to get a week or two later and how many deaths you were going to get a few weeks later. So whether these people are asymptomatic or not, and a lot of them actually are pre-symptomatic, which is a different thing, the tests are very useful for showing you the direction of travel, almost perfectly, accurate actually, in showing you the general trajectory. And the general trajectory, unfortunately, in Britain, every time we've been out of lockdown, has been very bad.
It's so hard. I mean, I that's why I love it's a great intellectual exercise to watch the arguments between the two of you. But so I'm at a nursing home, and you know, you kind of watch the first epidemic kind of roll out in March. You know, 20% of the patients I was taking care of died. It was really terrible. And, you know, we were masking, we were whatever, we had N95s, we were gloving. It's very, very hard in a sick nursing home patient population where there's a lot of care being delivered by staff. You know, it's not something that you can necessarily, you know, they're in there 4 or 5 hours of the day. You know, they're doing, you know, bowel movements have to be, you know, it's just a very intimate thing, and there's close quarters there. And just, you know, it was just impossible, or it seemed impossible. And then after that initial wave, we had, you know, we had a quiet period of time, and we started doing what we had asked for as nursing home kind of medical people there. Said, look, we really want to try to cohort people, try to protect people, because this is so deadly here. And so let's try to start a screening program. We started a screening program. The state finally agreed, came up with a screening program, and we had tons. And then we had another wave of COVID. And again, but this time, this wasn't the sick COVID folks who ended up in the hospital within 3 or 4 days of getting it. These were symptomatics that we tested that were positive, that then ended up in the hospital, ended up in ventilators. You know, a large percentage of them died. That was what happened in March. Now we had a ton more testing available to us, you know, the next time this thing came around in the fall, and we were testing everyone. You know, every week we were testing everyone. And now again, we had this rise of COVID, except this time the rise in COVID was folks that had minimal or no symptoms. In that next wave, there were only two deaths. So I'm sure.
Were you testing people who'd already had COVID as well?
Yeah, we were testing everyone.
Because that's where the issue is with the PCR. It's the only issue with the PCR for emergency that for weeks afterwards you can still test positive. When the way to get around that is to not test people. I mean, the policy in Britain is you don't test people. Well, if they've already had it, you don't test them for another 90 days. For people who are being routinely tested, doctors and nurses, you give them the lateral flow test, and if they test positive for that, then you give them the PCR.
No, this was only 3 months after, meaning we weren't testing within that 3-month period of time. So this is so it reflected, and we didn't have many reinfections. Honestly, we didn't have people that were COVID positive in March, negative, and then COVID positive. I don't think we had a single one, honestly. So I mean, the problem is, you know, that's just one local community. I'm not going to try to generalize that to the vast majority of people. I'm sure that, you know, we had more COVID, and the waves were real. The hospitals were filling up, you know, filled up again to some degree or the other. So, but again, this is where I'm going to suggest that it's probably the case in different local communities, right? There's very different things happening. And if you just have one, you know, even Philadelphia as a decision-making point, which is, you know, whatever the city that I'm in, people making decisions at the level of Philadelphia is probably making a decision that is too big, right? Local North Philly is different than West Philly is different. The risk factors are different. You know, it's just, I don't know that what worked. I don't know if that they're going to be able to be granular enough to be making the right decisions for folks, which is why you just want to try to get down to that local piece as much as possible. But beyond that's just a one point. But here's the thing: a lot of what you're discussing between you and Mr. Young is partly built on the fact that, look, we definitely should have locked down the way we should have, because there's an end in sight. The vaccine came, right?
Yeah.
Right. That's a fair statement, right? But if you have a synchronized global lockdown, correct? That is Australia-like or New Zealand-like. When do you think the vaccine would get here?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't heard much about New Zealand and Australia vaccinating people. I don't know what their long-term strategy is.
No. I'm saying the vaccine. I mean, no, they're going to vaccinate, but the vaccine arrived when it did, because the vaccine had to make it through phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. The phase 3 trials, by the time you hit, you know, November 3rd or November 4th or whatever, had, you know, about 50,000 patients with at least two of the mRNA trials, right? So those trials, the reason they were able to get completed and be done within a year was specifically because the US had massive outbreaks that made enrolling in those RCTs very, very easy. So if the United States, first of all, is a country that it's impossible to lock down. So there's some social thing. There's whatever, I'm not going to mention it, but some massive amount of crowds are going to be in the street, and and the public health advisors are going to say, no, lockdowns don't matter because this is more important. Whatever. But the practicalities of it are what it is. But suppose we could lock down the United States, like folks wanted. We would not. The reason the world has a vaccine, at least the world has a U.S. vaccine, or an FDA-approved vaccine, not some Chinese or Russian vaccine, which we don't know the efficacy of, is because we had massive outbreaks in the United States that allowed 60,000 people to be enrolled and to get results within a very short period of time. There's no way.
We appreciate your sacrifice. We actually the Oxford vaccine actually ended up being tested in Brazil a lot,
right?
Because in the summer we didn't have enough people with the virus.
Exactly right. That's exactly why the AstraZeneca vaccine was delayed, because they couldn't enroll enough in the UK, because you guys.
Well, we didn't have enough cases to get up to the numbers. Yeah.
My point exactly. So I mean, what are we going to do? Just allow Africa to go through some? I mean, again, the folks that are least able, Africa and India, to do this. I mean, so in some sense, like, the folks that are locking down are selfish.
Well, in a way, I mean, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, I don't know. There's always going to be places where you can test the vaccine with the global pandemic, I guess. It doesn't really change my view on lockdown.
But I mean, Chris, are you saying you were in favor of this particular lockdown in the UK at that point in time, under these circumstances? I mean, it seems that that's what you're saying. But
if we hadn't had any vaccines even on the horizon at this point, things would have to be different, wouldn't they? I mean, we couldn't just carry on doing this. I was very against the second lockdown. We didn't have anywhere near the numbers we did in December, in November. It seemed to me that the public health establishment were just desperate to lock down as much as possible. And I always felt that winter would be the worst time, and January lockdown was probably inevitable. But yeah, the vaccines changed everything. Had it not been for the vaccine, I guess we would have had to try some kind of Great Barrington thing. I don't see any other option. I was leaning towards that even in August, because I was just so sick of the constant conversation about we need to go back into lockdown, we need to go back into lockdown. And overall, if I was gonna try and steel man Toby's argument, I think there is a perfectly sensible and honest argument to make against lockdowns. I just don't think that the lockdown skeptics are making it, because they're not prepared to face reality. I mean, I think you can say that quite plausibly in Britain, if we had an uncontrolled epidemic, about 400,000 people would die. We've had 130,000 people die, with roughly a quarter of the population having had it. There's no reason to think 80% of people wouldn't get it if it was uncontrolled. So it's about 400,000 people dying. Now, you can make an argument saying it is simply not worth closing down the country for a whole year, having GDP decline by 10%, have millions of people out of work, for the sake of 400,000 people dying. Now, a lot of people find that morally abhorrent to make that argument, but actually you can make it in terms of health as well, because a declining economy and millions of people out of work has impacts on health. And the lockdown skeptics don't really do that, because they'd rather just pretend that nobody would die and that lockdowns don't work, and they just want to have their cake and eat it. And rather than have that difficult conversation, and I wouldn't cut through, I don't think, with the public, because the idea that you can put a price on human life doesn't cut through with people anyway. But actually, you can make a perfectly rational case for that without having to come up with all this nonsense, claiming that not only do lockdowns not work, but lockdowns actually kill people. And it's the countries which have the biggest lockdowns which have the most death. And there's some sort of causal relationship that goes against what the obvious causal relationship is there. Countries that are very badly hit have to lock down really hard. So that's the argument that I would be making if we didn't have vaccines. But fortunately, I don't have to, because we've got vaccines. And so although I don't necessarily have to defend the previous lockdowns, I can absolutely defend this one, because even in terms of dollars and cents, I think you can say that, you put a valuation of £60,000 on a year of life. You assume that each person who dies is going to save 10 years. That's £120 billion. I don't think this lockdown will cost on net 120 billion pounds, bearing in mind that if we didn't have a lockdown, there would still be a massive economic cost from having,
Right, the pandemic.
half the workforce off sick for a start, and people dying all over the place. So in economic terms and in every other term, I think you can justify this one. I'm not sure, as I said at the start, I'm not sure actually, if you look back over the entire year and see all the damage that's been done by lockdowns, whether that cost benefit analysis necessarily goes the same way. But you have to remember, even in the kind of uncontrolled epidemic situation, it's not something that's over in 2 months. You still have waves, because people would still lock themselves down, I think, to some extent. So it would drag on and on. So I really don't know, and I'm not going to attempt to do the numbers, but there's no point. This is my final point on this. There isn't even any point in doing a cost benefit analysis to try and persuade lockdown skeptics, because they don't accept that there are any benefits in the first place to locking down. So if you're just dealing with people who just flat out want to believe that everything the government has done has created all the problems, and the virus itself is really a trivial problem, you can't deal in terms of costs and benefits, because they just don't accept it.
Correct. I mean, I think you're absolutely correct, and you bring that out very nicely in your pieces, that that certainly lockdowns, could have, and probably do have a benefit. Although again, they have the argument of saying, well, what about Florida and what about Sweden? To which you would say, well, listen, there's variability. That doesn't mean that lockdowns don't work. I mean, they certainly can. I mean, they may not have been necessary. They may not have worked in certain situations, but lockdowns can and do work in reducing cases and hospitalizations and whatnot. That is correct. But I think because the ultimately what is a utilitarian calculus is so impossible to make for the lockdowns or against the lockdowns. I mean, it's really impossible to make, because the lockdowns, perhaps they help in reducing cases and whatnot, but there are social costs. I mean, not economic costs per se, but social costs that are very important. And there are also political costs, because now all of a sudden you give to the public health department, the prerogatives to decide the crisis anytime and so forth. And these can be very, very damaging long term.
And you can't measure them.
Right, and you can't measure them. That there has to be a principled approach. And my stance is against lockdown, not because it's going to make the world better, rosier economically, but on principle. I think, for example, if the UK has decided to have the NHS, which is always on the brink of getting overwhelmed and whatnot, as a country, it needs to assume the consequences of the decision that it has made. Same thing for the US. The US is not that much better in terms of healthcare. Anish talks about the capacity we have, which is true, but we really have a very dysfunctional healthcare system in general. So if we have a dysfunctional healthcare system, if we choose to make these political decisions that I think are bad, we, as libertarian, I want to say the country needs to assume the consequences of that. I'm not going to all of a sudden say, well, lockdowns are fine just because we're on the brink. I'm going to say, listen, we have to pay the price. And then if a lot of people die as a result, that's terrible. I'm not exactly sure how the chips will fall at the end of the day, right, when all is said and done. But I'm reluctant to give the public health sector the essentially the prerogative to say, this is, here it is, it's the crisis is bad enough, we need to lock down. If we tell them that it's okay in December, then they're going to say, at any time they can make the decision, because at the end of the day, it's not you or I, Chris, who are making the calls. It's going to be the bureaucrats and the public.
Well, it's sort of, but it comes down to public opinion ultimately. If public opinion was against the lockdown, it wouldn't happen. Public opinion, as it happens, is fanatically in favor of the lockdown in Britain. About 85% of people are in favor of it, about half of whom think it should be even more strict. So, you can argue that people have been, excessively scared of it, and they don't understand, that the risks maybe aren't as great to them as they think. But either way, when it comes to a collective action problem, a genuine public health problem, as opposed to, smoking and drinking and stuff, which actually are not public health problems, they're just aggregated individual health problems, then there is sometimes need for collective action. Throughout history, we've quarantined people. That quarantine is a restriction on people's freedom. We are now quarantining everybody, which is also a restriction on freedom. But because there are so many negative externalities and indirect harms happening here, it has to be for the general public to decide. It has to be a democratic decision. Unfortunately, that's that's the nature of a public health issue. Is it comes down to collective decisions. I mean, the classic example being air pollution. Individuals cannot avoid air pollution in their cities, and we don't want to close the factories down completely because that has negative consequences too. And so as a society, you democratically decide how much pollution you are prepared to tolerate. And it might be too much for some people and too little for other people, but that's just too bad. There's no other way of deciding it. We can't decide these things individually. That's, again, what makes them different to, your decision of how much to drink or, how much sugar you want to consume. Those are individual questions that might have an effect on your health, but they don't have an effect on anybody else's health, so it's none of the government's business. Whereas infectious diseases roaming around the country and air pollution, they are issues for everybody. No man is an island on that. So unfortunately, I think even libertarians have to accept that. However, I'm very sympathetic to your argument. I don't think there is a slippery slope here, because I don't think the public are going to be, desperate to go into lockdown again, and certainly not for the kind of routine diseases like flu that could possibly be used as a justification for. I just don't see it happening. I think people actually are fairly level-headed about this. They understand that this is an exceptional situation. And I think actually public opinion quite soon will turn against lockdown as we see the number of people vaccinated and the number of cases continue to fall. So I'm not too worried about that, although I am always wary of the public health lobby. Obviously, it's my kind of day job is writing about them and how they're always taking us down a slippery slope. But perhaps that's a good reason for somebody like me to actually be supportive of action in a genuine public health problem, rather than just being part of the awkward squad that always resists any government action about any health issue. I don't know, but I mean, I respect your position, and I think it's a lot more straightforward and honest than a lot of the lockdown skeptics' position, because you're not denying there's a problem. You're just saying let the cards fall where they may. And maybe I am being a bit utilitarian about this, but the reason I'm in favor of freedom and would call myself a libertarian is because I think it does create the best outcomes. If I thought it made things worse, I wouldn't be one. I'm not some natural rights guy or something. I genuinely think that if you allow people to make their own decisions, you get the best outcomes. But with this particular issue, allowing people to make their own decisions doesn't necessarily lead to the best outcomes, because people have the wrong incentives. They frequently have nowhere near enough information to make the right decision, even if they want to. And so, unfortunately, I think you can justify government action.
Well, Anish, do you have anything to say to that?
Well, that's spoken as a socialist. That's what he would say. No. I totally no. I think you're right on about the fact that there very quickly became this idea that among the lockdown skeptics, in order to make their argument that to minimize the burden of the virus.
Yeah.
And I think that was where things went astray. I think you're absolutely right. It would have been way more. It was on. I think I likened the analogy once it was upon us to a war analogy. I said, look, go to war. There's going to be a significant number of casualties. Is it? And those are the hard decisions to make. There are good wars, there are bad wars, and obviously. Unfortunately, the rhetoric is so heated that it became like, you want to kill, then somebody would say you want to kill grandma. It's just a very tough thing. And I don't understand how great societies would ever would fight great wars, honestly. I don't get how, we sent our 17 to 19-year-olds, tens of thousands of them, hundreds of thousands of them, to these wars to fight whatever
for freedom. And
that's that's the type of argument that I don't know that we can make anymore. Was it reasonable to have a casualty rate to preserve our freedoms? We've done that before. Why is that argument so hard to make now?
Well, I totally take that point that we we send people out literally to die for freedom.
Yeah.
And we did that in the Second World War. But sometimes we also send people out to their death in stupid wars that we shouldn't be fighting. And
Okay.
I think that when you have a vaccine just invented and you started distributing it, to make that the point at which you decide, actually, we're just going to let it rip. I know the lockdown skeptics hate it when you use the phrase let it rip, but how else do you describe having an uncontrolled epidemic? I mean, I think that's just really stupid. It's such a stupid and impatient thing to do. Just when you have the solution, how would it look to people in history looking back? They go, these guys they developed vaccines, multiple vaccines in record time, which were really effective. They'd been through lockdowns, they'd suffered all the pain, the economic misery, and then just as they got a vaccine, they decided it doesn't matter, they're going to let everyone get the virus. It's just a stupid thing to do. So it's much more like the First World War than the Second World War, I think.
No, perhaps, but I think we have to be careful, because I don't think the war analogy works, and it really doesn't for that reason, because the virus is not here to take our freedom. The virus is not here to conquer the country. The Black Plague decimated a third of the European population, right? It was, I mean, a complete devastation. Yet that wasn't a threat to the integrity of the countries. The societies remained. I mean, they changed. They were affected by the Black Plague. They changed, but they were not. So the war analogy doesn't work really. If you're attacked in a war, of course, you go. There'll be the government will intervene. You know, if it's a right war, a just war, you know, you should be a natural rights guy, a natural law guy. You know, if it's a right war, then there's room to take away the freedom temporarily in order to preserve the integrity of the country, right? To save the Commonwealth. But the virus is not a threat to the Commonwealth. The virus is a threat to individual lives. And I think, and government intervention in that case is always going to be you know, to be misapplied. Is it they're gonna you know, quarantine the wrong people? It's gonna be heavy-handed. It may save some lives, but in the process it will impoverish others and whatnot. And so I think on principle, the war analogy is not really a good guide for how we respond to pandemics. And I say that because we may be faced with this soon, right? I mean, maybe this vaccine will work for a while. Maybe there'll be a mutation. Maybe there'll be another pandemic. So we kind of need to be prepared. I mean, I'm concerned that if this pandemic dies down now, we're going to sort of go back to the usual. But it's a very important, as you said, it's a once in a century, maybe once in a whole history event that we're confronting here with this pandemic in terms of the role of government and how it should be.
But that's why, Michel, it's not necessarily a war against the virus. It's a war against people that would take away our freedoms. The virus is not taking away our freedoms. It's people's responses to it are taking freedom. And in order to make a solid argument, you know, which is what Chris is pointing out, is that you have to say, look, I may, as a healthcare worker, I may, you know, because I'm willing to protect these freedoms, that means I may end up on a ventilator. That means I may end up dying. That means my colleagues. I mean, you know, there has to be, and I don't know how we approach the next pandemic in a smarter way, unless we kind of stop being ninnies about this. I mean, we've been very spoiled for a very long time because we haven't fought any massive great wars. We haven't had to send our kids to war. You know, these are the type of wars we may have to fight where we have to understand that freedom isn't free. There's a casualty rate to it. And the casualty rate isn't necessarily sending our young boys to the beaches of Normandy. You know, that it may be doctors and it may be nursing home residents that have to bear some of the brunt of that, not for lack of trying. I'm not saying, you know, again, I hate the let it rip things. We're going to try and do our best, but it seems unreasonable to think that we can have no casualty rate when these things happen. And by the way, if the vaccine is light at the end of the tunnel, I think people really have to think, you have to have raging pandemics to get a quick vaccine. And where are we going to have those raging pandemics? Should we just have them in the developing countries?
Brazil and America. That seems to be enough.
Well,
you guys are volunteering for it. That's fine. Well, let me just come back on a couple of those points. I mean, you say the Black Death, it didn't change society. Well, I mean, society is nothing more than, you know, a large group of people, and about 1/3 of people died in the Black Death. So it changed them quite a lot. You know, it was a very bad thing. It didn't change society permanently, no. Well, it did for the better in many ways, but let's not get into that. but I'm not convinced that the COVID-19 lockdowns are going to permanently change society. I think actually when they're finished, people will really want to put it behind them and forget all about it. And we will probably change the way we plan for pandemics in the future. We'll probably be a bit quicker to close our borders to countries that suddenly announce a new virus, and that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. So I'm not convinced we change society. I think what Anish is saying is essentially that the freedom is worth more than lives. And I guess that depends on whether you die or not, you know? I mean, at one level, that's obviously true. And we do sacrifice people's lives to maintain freedom. But again, that's because our way of life is permanently under threat. It's not a temporary aberration like the lockdowns have been. So I don't know. I mean, I'll just repeat what I said before. Right. I just think that this process in Britain, given that I think we were facing a humanitarian disaster, and it was avoidable. Yes, there was a great cost to the way we've avoided it, but it was avoidable. It was also inevitable. Let's face it. I mean, there's just no way the government was going to allow the kind of carnage that was going to happen, and the reason it wouldn't allow it is because the public didn't want to allow it. Now, I never want to just appeal to public opinion to try and win a debate, but you know, I agree with the public on this one, and that freedom is not absolutely sacrosanct. We wouldn't presumably, you know, sacrifice 99% of the population for freedom. So at some point, there's you know, you can justify tougher action, right? Well, I wouldn't be calling for this if it had a fatality rate like flu. Probably even libertarians of the most extreme kind would be calling for it if it had a 50% fatality rate. So I don't think it's a matter of principle. I think it's a matter of degree.
Well, you're right that the lockdowns are not going to change us that much, because I think the lockdowns essentially are part of the expectation. I mean, we live in a society that expects lockdown. I mean, that's why they're so popular, as you said. I mean, we sort of, it's a society that assumes that the government should step in to you know, to save our lives, essentially. I mean, we have healthcare systems, government healthcare. So my point is that I'm trying to change the culture in a way to move governments away from healthcare, you know, providing healthcare system, you know, healthcare in general. I think it's done a dismal job and that sort of thing. But your point is correct that it's not gonna, the lockdowns may not be as changing as the lockdown skeptics might fear, precisely because they're already part of the expectation of society.
They're also not totally unprecedented. I mean, you're in right. Philadelphia, right, Anish?
Yep.
I was reading about the Spanish flu
Yep.
Recently. You know, I saw Philadelphia was incredibly hard hit, and they closed the churches and they closed the shops. And I don't think they actually had a stay-at-home order, but they had mandatory mask laws.
Yep.
And basically had a lockdown because there was nowhere to go because everything was closed down. So these are not totally unprecedented, and that didn't lead to, you know, mandatory mask wearing for the next 100 years.
Right. Yep. No, absolutely. No, so you know, that's the local flavor. You know, Philadelphia is much smaller back then. So I would say get as local as you can. You know, so let Northeast Philly do something different than West Philly. Let do something different than the, you know, the mainline suburbs. You know, these different boroughs of the city. So that, you know, so. That would be my general take on it, that, you know, we should try, but it's challenging. And I think all of that stuff is kind of a little bit of, you know, pissing in the wind, if you will, because none of that stuff, as local as you get, it's not like we're going to avoid we're not going to avoid a casualty rate. There's going to be a casualty rate. And, you know, I just would think that the cost of the mitigation that's going to happen just by, you know, Philadelphia is going to do it regardless of what Pennsylvania says or not, if it's going to be really bad, just like happened in 1918. The cost of that mitigation effort, you know, is probably going to be less if we allow more local control to take place. But that's all.
Chris Snowdon, that was terrific. Where can people, you have a great blog. Can you tell us what the URL is?
It's just called Velvet Glove Iron Fist. If you Google that, it should come up.
Okay, I'll have that on the show notes. And your Twitter handle? CJ
Snowdon.
Great.
DON.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Great talking.
Absolute pleasure. Take care.
Yep. Thank you.